Welcome, another episode of Cross-Examination. I'm your host, Mark Curran, and today our guest is Tim McCarthy, who's a longtime Secret Service, longtime Chief of Police, Orland Park, one of the great heroes in law enforcement, and somebody that we can all have a lot of confidence in. Tim, welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be with you.
Growing up, you grew up in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood in Chicago, right?
Well, a little bit farther, went to school in Auburn Gresham at Leo High School, but grew up in the Ashburn neighborhood, another mile or so west of Auburn Gresham along 79th Street.
And so that neighborhood's changed a lot, hasn't it? It got a little rough.
Yeah, it's crime has certainly increased there, sadly. And as you know, the Chicago Police Department is under a lot of stress these days from the standpoint of manpower, woman power, and personnel in general. So they're struggling a bit. They got some great people, but they can only do so much with so many people.
So, Tim, you went to St. Leo, as you mentioned, and I went to Loyola Academy. We would play Leo, and Leo was a smaller school by then, and everything else, but it's still around. Actually, my kids played them in football this year or last year, and they go to Carmel and Mundelein. You went to the University of Illinois, and you walked on for football. How did that happen?
Well, when I was at Leo High School, I wrestled, and believe it or not, my freshman year at Leo, I wrestled 103 pounds. I grew quite a bit after that, and of course, played grammar school football, and they encouraged me to come out for football. But it wasn't until about my senior year when I started all of a sudden stretching out and gaining weight. So I went down to Illinois, and by that time, I was about 180 some pounds, believe it or not. My mother would comment that it was like every week she'd have to get a new pair of pants, new shirts, and so forth. So I walked on at Illinois. At that time, you couldn't play varsity football as a freshman. Was on the freshman team. And then after that, as a walk-on, you get invited back, if they see that, might be some value to the team. And I was invited back, became a part-time starter my sophomore year and got a scholarship that year and started my entire junior year, got banged up a little bit my senior year. So great experience. And of course, I'm a big follower of Illinois football, season ticket holder, be going down in 2 weeks for the spring game. And just a couple last year, Coach Bielema created the Tim McCarthy Scholarship for walk-ons. And they awarded one last year, and they're going to award another one at the spring game this year. So it was a great experience for me as a walk-on and playing for 4 years. But it's a 1,000% commitment in sports in college now.
Absolutely. And so you played football at Illinois. How did that prepare you for life? Because, a lot of mothers out there nowadays are not wanting their young boys to play football and everything else. And it just seems like there's great lessons to be learned.
Well, I think it is. And I know there's been some controversy along the way of injuries in football. And actually, I talked to Coach Bielema about it. I coached youth football for about 10 years at St. Alexander's, our parish. And there was, when the coaches are fairly well trained and teach kids the proper fundamentals, then those things are minimized. And yes, I think there has clearly been a reduction in youth football, but Coach Bielema tells me that he thinks it's coming back again. And remember, there's injuries in all sports. Hockey, of course, is a contact sport.
Right.
Soccer is a heck of a contact sport.
Yeah, soccer has more concussions than football.
I hear that. So I think it's coming back, and good coaching and good equipment, good technique prevent most of those things. But it's a contact sport. 2 of my grandsons are going to be playing tackle football this year, I'm told by their mothers. So we'll see how that goes. But, you need proper coaching, proper technique, and proper equipment. It minimizes that in all the sports.
We are on WSFI Catholic Radio 88.5 FM, 750 AM. Our guest is Tim McCarthy, the longtime police chief of Orland Park, and he's also somebody that you may recognize from being shot when he took a bullet for Ronald Reagan. Tim was also a football player at the University of Illinois and just a real Catholic gentleman. So we're getting his take on what's going on in the world and what have you. Tim, so what was the magnet to go into law enforcement?
Well, Mark, my father was a sergeant in the Chicago Police Department, so I had that exposure to it. So my major was finance at the University of Illinois. Actually, I started in engineering, but moved on to finance. Then in my senior year, he started doing interviews with different companies. At the same time, I took the test for the Secret Service, had planned on taking it for the FBI and even the Chicago Police Department. So I took the test for the Secret Service, and lo and behold, just about the time I graduated, actually a couple of months after I left the University of Illinois, they offered me a job. And I had been exposed to Secret Service a little bit through my father's experiences and the FBI, and certainly growing up on the south side of Chicago, every other household is a policeman or a fireman. So, but like any college senior, you're looking for a job, and the Secret Service offered me one. Now, there's a few things they didn't tell me about that job, but in any case, it was almost 22 year, retired 22 years after being in the Secret Service. And it was a fascinating career. I saw things and went things and even heard things that few people ever experience, but at a cost too.
I spent a lot of my career as a prosecutor and then as sheriff, 25 years combined between the two. And, especially when I was young, you always saw it as like the good side and the bad side. There's a battle of good and evil, and the police and the prosecutors are on the good side. We wear the white hats, and the defense attorneys and the criminal defendants are on the bad side, and they wear the black hats. So did you see it kind of like that, as kind of like a spiritual battle, law enforcement at that time?
Yeah. And my view was, both in the Secret Service, we did a lot of criminal investigations, and out of my 22-year career, 13 of it was, doing criminal investigations, counterfeiting, all sorts of white collar crime, then 8 or 9 years on protection. But I saw it, especially in the Secret Service, but especially as chief of police, every crime that occurred in Orland Park. And of course, I chaired the South Suburban Major Crimes Task Force for about 15 years, where we did the homicides in the south and southwest suburbs. It felt personal almost, because there's a victim. Most of the time, they weren't murders, but victims are still victims, and they're often overlooked in the process. And I felt great when we would make the arrest, prosecute the offender, in many cases put the offender in prison, both while I was in the Secret Service and as chief of police. So I took it kind of personal, maybe too personal when things happened. But I'm for the good guys, and as a chief of police, I'm there for the victims, but on the same token, to do the job constitutionally. And we got the Orland Park Police Department received an award for our constitutional policing by the Illinois Bar Association quite a few years ago. So I think we're doing it the right way, and results counted, and our crime rate was very low in Orland Park. And in most cases, our investigators, who are outstanding, along with our patrol officers, cleared most of the serious cases that we came across.
You ran a top shelf department in Orland all those years, and you were just such a credit. Let me ask you, so as you're going into this career in law enforcement, beginning with the Secret Service, how did your whole Catholic faith play into that, decision and what have you? And let me say one other thing, just for the listeners, just the smallness of the world. So my mother that raised me was a McCarthy. She lived at 9400 South Pleasant growing up, and we had law enforcement everywhere. And I think the Irish, just very much so. Those were the jobs we could get initially, and ultimately the Irish, the faith was the centerpiece of their lives, and being on that side fit nicely, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I would say, Mark, that the Catholic faith, and I hope most religions, give you the moral compass that you need to be in law enforcement. There are temptations along the way, certainly, but the moral compass is not just for the victim, but that the offender is treated constitutionally. So I think it gives you maybe a better perspective. Now, we stumble along. We're human, so we make mistakes, and I'm sure I made some mistakes along the way, and people could probably tell you a lot of them. But I think it provided me in particular with the right perspective. Yes, we want to catch every bad guy, no doubt about it. But sometimes you just can't do it. Even though you know who the bad guy is, you got to do it the right way. And I think that the Catholic faith, and I hope most religions, give you that proper moral compass to do the job, but to do it the right way.
And we're moving ahead in your career, okay? So you're in Secret Service. You get assigned to presidential detail where you're essentially protecting the president. And you started, what year did you start with the Secret Service?
1972.
72. So I want to move all the way ahead to March 30th, 1981, which is essentially almost 32 years, to the date we're talking now, just after Easter. And tell us about that day. That for those that are waiting, there's just a very interesting story.
Yeah. Well, I was in the Chicago field office doing criminal investigations for 7 years, and then was transferred to the Presidential Protective Division, and it was with President Carter to start with. He lost the election, and the presidential detail stays only with the president. So we transferred our people over to President Reagan, basically in thirds.
So were you presidential detail for Jimmy Carter also?
Yes, and President
How was
Bush.
Jimmy Carter? If you don't.
Well, he, based upon success, he didn't get reelected for what that means, but he certainly was he was a religious person, no doubt about it. He practiced his faith. Maybe the politics didn't go in his direction, and there was a number of things that happened, hostage negotiations. But I think
he was right on a lot of issues, but not right on abortion.
So I don't know that he had the strongest staff in the world. I think the staff, presidents succeed based upon their staff as much as anything else. But certainly he was a hard worker. He was a man to be at the Oval Office at 6 a.m. and not leave till 10 p.m. So he put the hours in. Maybe he didn't have the greatest staff. Maybe he did. But things didn't work out for him, and he lost the election.
He was a high-ranking naval officer. You would have thought that he'd have better executive skills than he did.
Yeah, he was a nuclear engineer.
Yeah. So we're moving ahead to Reagan. He's the president. March 30th, 1981. Tell us what happens. Tim McCarthy wakes up in the morning and is where'd you live, in Virginia or Maryland?
I live in Virginia. Yeah.
Okay. Wake up and
we had to be at the White House at 6:30. The shift started at 7, but you had to be there for briefings and so forth. And since we knew we were going to the Washington Hilton Hotel, the briefings, if the president's just staying at the White House, it's just a matter of managing his schedule at the White House, a very secure environment. On that occasion, he was going to the Washington Hilton Hotel, where the presidents went very regularly. Doesn't mean the advance work was done any differently. It's about a week's worth of work to get it set up based upon where the president is going to go and what's he going to do. And we were briefed on all the movements that we'd be making, the motorcade routes, the primary, secondary, the hospital, safe rooms, and all of where we would be throughout the entire movement at the Washington Hilton Hotel. So we were briefed up as usual. There was no threats, no unusual threats that we were told about. We went to the Hilton Hotel. It was raining out.
Had you ever heard of John Hinckley prior to that? John David Hinckley?
Never.
It was not on anybody's radar.
Yeah, he had been arrested at an airport with a weapon, as I recall now. But there's a lot of people arrested at airports with guns.
Right.
And that didn't rise to
back in those days. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and there was no indication that he had any interest in the president or anyone else at the time.
Right.
And nor would that be part of an interview necessarily of someone at the airport with a gun. But anyway, we went to the Washington Hilton Hotel. Interesting story. On that particular day, my rank would have been the equivalent of a sergeant. As a grade 13 in the government, but the equivalent of a sergeant.
The most important rank in a police department, right?
It certainly is. It's where the rubber meets the road.
Right.
And so we had a couple of extra people that day, which, to travel with the president, there's only a certain number. All the agents are there ahead of time, along with local police and other federal agencies securing a location. But traveling with the president, in the inner perimeter is only a certain number. Well, on that particular day, it was raining out. I had a new suit on, and back in that day, I didn't have too many new suits.
Well, you look good. Right? Yeah.
And it was a light colored suit. The follow-up car that we rode at the time basically leaked, so you're getting wet. So in any event, There was another agent there. We were both the equivalent rank of a sergeant, and the agent in charge said, "It doesn't matter. You're both briefed. You're both flip a coin." So we flipped a coin, and I lost the flip. The other agent stayed back at the White House handling operations there, and I went on to the Washington Hilton Hotel, and the rest is history. But history is that
union meeting, right? Wasn't that he was attending a union workers group?
Oh yeah, it was the building trades. And if I've read he kept a pretty good autobiography, and he thought it didn't go over well. And coincidentally, I worked as a laborer, during my college time, a couple of summers. So I knew a number of the people that were going to be there, and I was going to try to take them on a White House tour in the afternoon. And I talked to them before, and they were very excited about seeing the president.
Was it AFL-CIO was there too, I think.
I think so. Yeah. It was a big group. Is at least the Washington Hilton Hotel is kind of unique. The ballroom is downstairs, but it's big.
Here's what happens on that day that I want to just add a little details to it all. So Tim, the story that I read, you weren't actually assigned to that detail. It was kind of, they needed an extra body, and you was there a coin toss?
Yeah, but no. The schedule is a schedule, and we were all assigned. However, leaving the White House, we only leave with a certain number. Yeah. And so we had one extra person. So everything was the way it was supposed to be. The one person was going to be staying back. It just happened to turn out to be, well, we've got two sergeants. We only need one sergeant. We got a lieutenant. We got a commander, the agent in charge, and so forth. So it was a flip of the coin to determine, and it was just
the two of you.
It was just a funny thing, he said, let's flip a coin, and we actually did it.
Right. At what point in the morning you hear shots? Take us through what happened.
Yeah. Well, we, as I said, the ballroom at the Washington Hilton is below ground. So the president goes up and down in the elevator. Of course, there's the agent in charge is with him at all times. The rest of us run up the stairs. We come out the door. I think that was the P Street entrance. We're in our formation around the president. And in the briefings, the president was extremely busy. He'd only been in office a couple of months, had to get back to the White House quickly. So there was no indication he'd be working rope lines, as they often do. So we weren't expecting him to work it, but you never know. So you have to have your head on a swivel. I was in the number one position in the formation around the president, which was to the front left. Part of my duties was to ensure that the armored car limo was open as we approached it. The advance agent had it open, as he was supposed to do. I looked back at the president. He was waving. I was anticipating he was going to go to the rope line. He kept coming towards the car. And just at that instant, John Hinckley pushed himself forward in the crowd and fired 6 rounds in about 1.5 seconds and struck 4 people. Jim Brady was shot in the forehead, almost between the eyes. The president was shot under his left armpit. I was shot in the right chest, and Tom Delahanty was shot in the neck. And one round went into the armored window of the car as the president was being pushed in, and the last round went across the street, went through a window, hit a window over there as a gentleman was jumping on the back of John Hinckley.
And what type of gun did Hinckley have?
It was 22.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so 22.
Small caliber that bounces around.
I'm looking at that whole thing, and what you did is you put yourself in front of President Reagan at that moment in time when the shots were being fired, and that's why you were essentially hit, is that you were blocking his body. Yeah,
the training that we go through and is simulated regularly called attacks on the principal, AOPs, attacks on the principal, attack on the president. So we simulate those, and there's a couple of theories that you try to apply. One is the arm's reach theory. That is, if the weapon or the threat is within arm's reach, you go for it and attempt to take it away, neutralize it. And there's several cases where that happened. An agent by the Larry Boondorf took the gun away from Squeaky Fromm when she tried to shoot President Ford. He was within arm's reach. You don't want to go
around during that Ford. Obviously, you were with Secret Service at that time, but were you present on that day?
No, I was assigned in the Chicago field office at that time.
Yeah.
And then the second one is cover and evacuate. And in this case, the offender wasn't within arm's reach, So my job was to cover the president while he was evacuated by the agent in charge, the shift leader, and others.
People are trained to, and we've seen this in recent school shootings. Nobody's trained to stand on the outside anymore. Go all the way back to Columbine 25 years ago, and then the book was rewritten that you march, you run right through the door.
Rapid deployment now, yeah.
Yeah, but despite that training, people don't do it, every time. And maybe it's a little, I hate to use the word cowardice, but a little bit of fear and what have you. Now, you can train all you want, but did you ever contemplate the fact that when you're putting your body in front of the presidents like you did on that day, that may be your last breath? Did you contemplate that prior to March 30th, 1981?
Well, I thought about it, Mark, but, as you know, as sheriff, our policemen go down dark alleys chasing people. Our military go up and charge a hill in the face of gunfire. And you never know if you're going to do it when it happens. And frankly, I didn't know if I would do it when it happened. I don't know if it happened again tomorrow, if I would do it. I told our mayors in Orland Park that I serve that don't count on that happening. But it was really as a result of training. And that's what our officers do, our military does, even our firemen and all first responders. They do it based upon training. And, we're human. We don't get it right every time. But I'm thankful and thank God, quite frankly, that I did it right on that day. And I'm here to talk about it.
I'm confident you do it again. You're so much humility, Tim McCarthy. Yes. So did you know Reagan before that? He'd only been president for 2 months.
Not really. I was just a line officer, the agent in charge, and the assistant special agent in charge certainly had a relationship with him. Every 2 weeks we changed shifts. So I was on midnights for we changed every 2 weeks. So you didn't see much of the president and first lady in those 2 weeks. So no, he didn't know me there's a lot of people on the presidential detail, but I don't think he had any clue who I was.
Reagan's taken to the hospital, George Washington Hospital. Did you go to the same hospital, George Washington?
Yeah, Jim Brady, myself, and the president went to George Washington, and Tom Delahanty went to Washington Metro.
And, what are your thoughts? Did you know you were going to pull through?
Well, my thoughts were, who's going to get the best doctors?
Yeah. One of Reagan's, the famous Reagan line was that, I hope you're all Republicans.
Republicans, yeah.
Man, and they said we're all pro-Republicans today, or we're all.
Yeah, great response, Mark. I didn't know. I knew what had happened to me by the time I got to the hospital, and it was starting to get fairly painful. And they didn't know either. But I went in for X-rays right away, and then, frankly, they put me out. And I don't remember anything for, I guess it was a day or two later when I came out of recovery and finally woke up. And then I knew it appeared it was going to work out okay.
Yeah, 100%. So were you married then, back in 81?
Yeah, married with 2 children, yes.
2 children, yes. Right. So what year did you get married, by the way?
Got married March 17th, 1973. We just finished our 50th anniversary about 2 weeks ago.
You had a St. Patrick's Day wedding. What a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So where was it? At what parish?
St. Dennis Parish and the Southwest. Sure. We were both from the same parish, so it worked out great.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So what was the mindset of your wife and others at that point in time? They saw it, probably live.
Well, she saw it moments after it happened when one of my colleagues who wasn't working that day, and that we do have days off and so forth, called her. The call started rolling in immediately after it happened to our house, but that was before you had call waiting and voicemail and all that type of thing. And she saw it on TV, and she naturally knew exactly what happened, but of course didn't know the outcome. I mean, the focus was naturally on the president. One of my former partners who lived only a block away with his wife came and picked her up. So, and then he kind of kept her incommunicado on the way down there, even though he had his Secret Service radio and so forth, and drove her down to the hospital. His name was Dick Griffin, who I'm forever grateful for he and his wife. Got her to the hospital. And I think by that time I was in surgery. In fact, I'm certain I was in surgery. And, she met Mrs. Reagan and I think Mrs. Brady in the chapel.
Yeah. When you're thinking that there's a possibility you're not going to pull through, what weighs on you? Is the fact that you have young kids and you have a wife that needs you and everything else?
Yeah, it's moving to Washington D.C. was very expensive. We were living paycheck to paycheck. No two ways about it. It's very expensive. Their homes were expensive, and though we got a significant amount of overtime, after we sold a house for like $60,000, had to buy a house for $100,000 at that time. Yeah. Things were very, very, very tight at that time, and it crosses your mind, what's going to happen here?
How are they going to make it without me and my income?
Yeah. So
that's tough.
My wife wasn't working at the time. She was raising the two kids, and we had a third after that. So it would have been, she was the real trooper during this thing for sure. The unheralded heroes of these things are the spouses, frankly, that go through 100%. the emotional trauma and so forth.
I mean, you all defeated the odds. The chances of a couple staying married for 50 years when, the male was dedicated to law enforcement for 50 years are very small. I mean, the odds are that the marriage is not going to survive.
Well, I was in law enforcement for just about 50 years between Secret Service and chief of police in Orland, and then I did, interim chief at a couple at Mokina. But right. She grew up in the city. Her father was a train engineer, but grew up in can't help but to grow up in a first responder environment. Let me put it that way. So she knew, I guess, what she was getting into to an extent, but you never think it's going to happen to you.
Tell us how your faith played a role in helping you get through what had just happened, getting shot by John David Hinckley Jr.
Yeah. Well, I think going in that your faith makes you a little bit maybe more resilient, or I think it also makes you maybe prepared for something like this a little bit, that bad things do happen even to good people, supposedly. But I think it's resiliency. I think it's, believing that even if the worst thing happened to me, the good things would happen to my family afterwards.
Beautiful. That's so, beautiful. Yeah. You're familiar with the story of St. Thomas More, right? I mean, he went, St. Thomas More was beheaded, and at that point in time, none of his family really were strong in the faith at all. And as a result of that, they all became fervent members of the Catholic Church.
And I guess, God had some more plans for me, because if that bullet had gone 1 inch to the left, it was in the K5 area, as you know what that means.
Right. So you developed, as a result of that, a relationship with President Ronald Reagan. And just by way of background for the listeners also out there, a couple things. Peggy Noonan wrote a couple books about President Reagan. In his second book, When Character Mattered, she talks about the fact that Reagan never became a Catholic. His mom was a Protestant, and his dad was a Catholic, but his dad was kind of a meandering alcoholic that never really got it together, and his mom kind of raised him. But in her book, she talks about how basically Reagan surrounded himself with almost all Catholics, and he insisted on Ave Maria being played at his funeral, and he just seemed to have a great love for the Catholic Church, even though he never became a Catholic. Could you just, tell us a little bit about your relationship with Ronald Reagan and what that was like?
Well, it was a lot different after this took place. However, he still had to maintain a professional relationship too. But when we had visited him before leaving the hospital, I got out of the hospital before him. He said, Tim, we'll be getting together for dinner, or things like that. I didn't really think that was going to happen, but lo and behold, it was St. Patrick's Day about a year later. And and I'm sitting at a table with the president and Tip O'Neill, and believe it or not, they could get along, even though they had some monumental fights. But it was different then. They could have their monumental fights, but they would keep it professional rather than personal, and they could get along together. So I'm sitting at a table with President Reagan, Tip O'Neill, Hollywood stars, I think Frank Sinatra, John Wayne, and people like that, My wife was at a table with Mrs. Reagan, Maureen O'Hara, and others, and they were all drinking Guinness, or I can't remember, Guinness or Harp or something.
Yeah.
And the president didn't drink much anyway, but it's the occasion.
Yeah.
And they said, "Tim, would you like a drink?" And I go, "I've got all these other agents standing around the room and the agent in charge. I think not. I think maybe just a glass of water or tea would be just fine."
Right.
So it did change. Mrs. Reagan in particular was very gracious to my family constantly. I'd get Christmas gifts from the Reagans. Who gets that? And my wife, I said, we got to get one of my supervisory responsibilities on my second tour at the White House was Mrs. Reagan's detail. And when she went to anything controversial, I always traveled with her. So it came Christmas time, and I tell my wife, "You got to get a present for Mrs. Reagan." She goes, "What do I get? What do I get? A present? Present for the First Lady of the United States." So, but we did, and of course, Mrs. Reagan was very gracious.
She was like a very elegant lady that always dressed to the nines, just right.
Yeah. Oh, sure did. Yeah. So the relationship changed, and it was a wonderful relationship, but it was also a very professional relationship too, because God forbid something, we still had to protect the president and had to put aside, all the personal feelings and maintain a professionalism too. So it was probably just slightly complicated to that extent, but the president, the first lady, and all of their children and so forth couldn't have been more gracious forever.
Eventually, you decided to leave the Secret Service, and you went into policing in Illinois, back here. Tell us about that.
Well, I retired and actually went to work for a security company as a vice president called Security Link. It was an alarm company, and it was owned by a former member of the Secret Service, a fellow by the name of Jim Covert. And he'd been asking me for a couple of years, and I'd always turned him down. Finally, I'd been agent in charge in the Chicago field office for about 3 years, and most of my colleagues were running the Secret Service. They were the directors and assistant directors and deputy directors. And they'd been holding out, "Tim, we'd like to get you back in Washington again," which would have been our 5th transfer. And not that they would have done it. They would not have forced me to do it.
Right.
But I said, I'm still pretty young. There's time for another career. I enjoyed everything in the Secret Service. So I did this thing with the security company for only about 8 months. In the meantime, the chief of police job came open in Orland Park. We had a mayor, Dan McLaughlin, at that time, an outstanding mayor. I have to say that because he hired me, of course. But
they've had great mayors out there.
Yeah, and
Keith Beakow is your mayor.
Keith is the mayor. Yeah, he's doing a good job.
Yeah.
So when the job came open, I had a number of chiefs of police call me that were friends of mine, from South Suburban chiefs, Illinois chiefs, and said, "We hear you're applying for it." And I said, "I didn't even know it was open." And to be perfectly honest with you, I was making at that time with this security company in 1993 or 4, a huge salary. And the job as chief of police was about half of that. So in any case, I thought about it, talked with my wife, and decided to apply for it, and it went through the whole process. There was probably 40 or 50 applicants, as used to be the case. And came one of the final 5, interviewed by the Board of Trustees, and was ultimately selected and started in May of 94, and went on as chief for over almost 26 and a half years, which is slightly unusual, I know.
Right. It's a long ride.
We had a great mayor and great Board of Trustees that and village managers that allowed the chief to do the policing. And it was a great marriage.
So, and you at one time dabbled in politics. You had a run for the Secretary of State of Illinois.
Yeah.
And you ran as a Democrat back then.
Yeah.
I was elected as a Democrat. We were all Democrats, I think, if we were Irish Catholic and we had any lineage to Chicago.
Yeah.
That was our party. And Reagan kind of changed that a little bit. But can you tell us about your political run for a minute and just how your faith guided you through that?
Well, I was somewhat reluctant to do it, but thought about it, ran for Secretary of State in the primary against Jesse White, probably one of the most popular Illinois politicians.
He wound up being the highest vote getter forever.
Yeah. But to tell you the truth, I thought it was my background fitted the job. Secretary of State has a police department. Certainly,
Right.
they're a regulatory agency, which in policing is a regulatory agency. So I thought I could make a contribution at that point. And didn't quite work out the way I thought it was going to work out. Put a lot of work into it. I was extremely careful not to use 1 hour of vacation. You know, if I was doing anything for it, that I would take my hour of vacation time. So
Right.
so it was a good experience. It was difficult. You know, you get to the abortion issue and so forth, which is very, which is one of the biggest issues now and forever. Right. So that didn't.
At that point, I mean, you've always been pro-life, and at that point, the Democratic Party wasn't. There were most of the Chicago Democrats were marginally pro-life, at least.
Yeah,
it was just a different. It was a different time.
Yeah, it was certainly a different time. But I related to. I came from a working family. My father would have benefited if they had unions in the police department at that time, because they were certainly overworked and underpaid. And I'd been a laborer at one time or another, a Teamster at one time or another. So, we grew up in that type of environment. So that's what attracted me largely to run as a Democrat. Things have changed a bit. But in the end, while you don't do anything with the intent to lose, I remained as chief of police and had an absolutely wonderful career as a chief of police. It ended up after the George Floyd incident. About a year after that, I retired, and things have changed significantly since then.
Yeah, a lot of people have tried to get you to run again. I mean, I know the Republicans as well have tried to get you to run, and that one run was enough to say that I'm not really going to.
Well, I'll never say never, but one way or the other. But I haven't seen the nature of politics has changed an awful lot. Yeah. It's far more bitter than it was. Jesse White would come to Orland Park every year. The Teamsters.
Tim Ryan, my old boss, the Attorney General's favorite Democrat by far.
Yeah, and Jesse would come to Orland Park. I'd golf in it. It was a massive golf outing. I'd always kid him. I said, Jesse, you're now in my territory here. Yeah, anything can happen. But he was a perfect gentleman all the time, and we always kidded about it.
So Ronald Reagan and that date, March 30th, 1981, as a result of that, Jim Brady had been shot, and he became one of the loudest spokespeople, advocates for gun reform. The Brady bill eventually, which dealt with background checks, was passed, and he continued to advocate on behalf of that. How does Tim McCarthy feel about where we're at with guns right now in America? And there's a big debate now. Do people need AR-15s? And I'm interested from your Catholic lens, because some of these issues, they don't really, the Catholic Church, there's a lot of, leeway either way. Providential decision making, where a Catholic could essentially find themselves on either side of that issue.
Well, it's a very complicated issue, and I've seen plenty of gun violence up close. I think we have several steps to take. If we could eliminate all guns tomorrow, that would be ideal. But we know that's never going to happen. It's not realistic. We can't stop millions of people coming across the border with hundreds of millions of fentanyl pills. We can't seem to stop that. Tell me how we're going to stop the guns that will ultimately come across the border.
Right. We have more guns than we do have people.
But the first commitment we have to make is to prosecute gun crimes. We have to prosecute gun crimes. Now, in Orland Park, the last year I was chief, we had 30 or 40 gun cases. Now it's over 100. And yes, we do get charges, but ultimately they get reduced. And these are ag UUWs, class 4 felonies of people who are felons in possession of firearms. And they're not being efficiently prosecuted at all. So I think we have to make a commitment to that to start with. I question the need for assault rifles, but I don't see us taking them away from people either. But I think we have to do the fundamentals first. We have to prosecute criminals, and hold them accountable. When you see that happen, I think you will see gun violence being reduced. We also have to look at what we put on television. You can't tell me that the massive amount of gun violence that is portrayed on television every day in our movies constantly doesn't have something to do with it. We also have to do a little work on mental health. In Orland Park, I started our CIT program, our crisis intervention training, and the problems with mental health are monumental, and they shouldn't be police problems.
So I watch all the shows with guns because that's I kind of had that law enforcement. Like the bad guys versus good guys, but sometimes the way it can be portrayed, I suppose, right? And in the younger audiences, that's the more problematic.
Yeah, I mean, they're influenced by the gaming and so forth that they do, by television, and I believe there's something to that.
With regards to the Second Amendment, being in the Constitution and Bill of Rights, one of the things, and I'm the same as you. I mean, we're city kids. We didn't have guns growing up. There's no. We weren't like out hunting or anything like that. It's this big love affair with guns is not really you or me, but the people that are going after the guns are the same people that are going after other liberties. And that's what I worry about a little bit is that First Amendment and Second Amendment and Fourth and Fifth Amendment, they're all kind of tied together. Do you see that as a problem? Well,
sure. But show me initially how that we are taking the first step to those that commit crimes with guns, that we are holding them accountable, because we're not. Time and again, all the crimes are being committed by recidivists, parolees, people on probation, people who have been convicted 3, 4, or 5 times. Guns are going to get through our borders. Guns are going to keep coming back into this country. But I would not rule out that if we take that first step and actually do that and get that, that you could convince me to get rid of assault rifles. You probably could, but right now we are not doing that. We're simply not doing that. But let's be realistic. We're never going to get rid of guns one way or the other.
You're listening to 88.5 FM, 750 AM, WNDZ. I'm Mark Curran. The show is Cross-Examination. Our guest is the wonderful longtime police chief, Tim McCarthy, former Secret Service, former chief of Orland Park Police. Tim, so you're like kind of like the old school, Clint Eastwood type guy, very masculine. And you grew up, playing football and all that. Now we're living in a world where it's, masculinity is like a negative. And there seems to be this push that there's really no difference between men and women and what have you. Do you think that's a problematic with regards to today's world? And what does your Catholic faith have to say about that?
Well, I believe the Catholic faith recognizes a man and a woman. Yeah. And I haven't heard the Cardinal, what his position on it, or the Pope. Transgenders still have to be treated properly and fairly, but I don't want to see this in the schools. If someone decides to change their gender, they can do it. On the other hand, I don't want to see it in the schools. That's something between the parents and 100%. That person, if they decide to do something like that, which, is often cases irreversible, but I don't want to see it. It's the public schools, and they do a great job. Don't get me wrong. I have nothing against public schools, but I don't want that type of thing in my public school with my kids or with my grandkids. That's between the parents and their child, and not the government.
They do a great job out in Orland. They don't do such a good job in Chicago.
Chicago's a different animal, Mark. Yeah. It's a different animal.
Absolutely, brother. So, Tim, one of the things that has been under attack, and they're constantly looking for ways to reinvent. And my theory is that unless you have a moral compass, you're going to be a problem in law enforcement. And so we don't need all this like retraining and what have you. There's been some more training than ever. And when these police officers are out of line, generally they did something that morally was unacceptable. It's not that they were trained that way. And I put that forward to you. What should we be doing in law enforcement as we move into the future? And also the fact that I have to acknowledge, having been a prosecutor all these years and having been a sheriff, that there is a tendency to not rat on your brother in law enforcement. And I think that's, like you mentioned, George Floyd earlier, four guys standing around, somebody should have said something. Laquan McDonald, I mean, the report shouldn't have all read the same. That's not what happened, So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I condemned the George Floyd thing with my department. In our department, we had African Americans and excellent police officers. And I was thrilled that I got an email back from one of our officers, Chief. The proudest moment of my time in the Orland Park Police Department was when you put out that email and had meetings condemning what happened there. And it was easy to condemn. So, but I think we have to treat people, everything seems to be about race and about gender and so forth. You just have to treat everyone the same. That's all. Right. Everyone the same. And what happened to George Floyd shouldn't have happened to anybody. But one of the things I want to mention is what happened to George Floyd was wrong. We condemn it, should never happen. But the Minneapolis Police Department fired that officer. He was prosecuted. He went to jail. They did all the right things. Now, maybe public pressure had something to do with it, but I can tell you 25 years ago, that probably wouldn't have happened. So Minneapolis police were dead wrong in what happened. And we all know chokeholds. The chokeholds have been barred in Illinois a long time prior to this, whether it was with your arm or your knee or anything like that. So he was wrong. But Minneapolis police did the right thing. And that should have been celebrated a little bit. But maybe it was because of public pressure they did it. I don't know if that's the case or not. But training, you have to have good training. And justice is supposed to be blind, period. And it doesn't seem to be blind anymore, that we have to consider race and gender. No, we don't. We have to treat everyone fairly the same and constitutionally. And I think, yes, police, there is a code of silence to an extent. I think it changed. It has changed. Yeah. And I think it's going to continue to change. But everyone has to be treated the same. Race, gender identity has nothing to do with it. Treat everyone the same.
So we're wrapping up right now. We're just about done. WSFI Catholic Radio, our wonderful guest, Tim McCarthy. We're so grateful for him and so grateful for his life of service. Tim, let me just maybe finish with this. Where do we go from here? If there's young Catholic men or women out there that are considering what should they do with the rest of their lives, would you tell them to get into law enforcement? And if so, why? And what advice from your Catholic upbringing would you give to them to help them survive?
Well, I did almost 50 years, and I would encourage them to get into law enforcement. The pendulum swings back and forth. But as a Catholic, your faith teaches you to treat everyone the same. It teaches you that. Just maintain that faith, maintain that attitude that everyone gets treated the same. Again, policemen are being asked, quite frankly, to do things that really don't belong in their arena. And one of the things that we forget is our military does a superb job. They deploy for a year, sometimes longer. They come back, they retrain, they get time away from it. Our police do not get any time away from it. And we're going to have to look at the fact that somewhere down the road, I mean, we're asked, whether it's mental health, whether it's using Narcan, the things the domestics that God himself cannot solve are being asked to do things that we weren't asked to do a number of years ago. And we'll continue to do them. And we have to emphasize the positive. Every day, police are doing absolutely superb things in the city of Chicago, in our suburbs, in our 100%. Counties. And yes, we make mistakes. We need to be held accountable for them. We're being held, but we don't need to be persecuted for them either. I think there's been some cases where there's been a little bit, the police don't get the benefit of the doubt anymore in situations where you're making a decision in not a split second, in a millisecond.
Yeah, we have a legislature in Illinois that's very hostile towards law enforcement.
There's no question about that. They're wrong-headed on this, and I hope they. And the result is more victims and more victims.
Amen. So we're wrap it up. We're done. We want to really thank Tim McCarthy, just a wonderful, wonderful leader. It was a terrific police chief, one of the best known.
You didn't do bad yourself, Mark.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. And so usually I remember to say a prayer before we start, but we'll do like the French and say grace afterwards. In the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now at the hour of death. Amen. We'll call upon the intercession of St. Michael, protect our women and men in blue out there. We ask that you continue to protect Tim McCarthy, his family, and the Holy Spirit to guide him as he continues to be used by the Lord to do so much great work. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Mark. God bless you.
You too, brother.
Bye.